am so delighted to welcome all of you here tonight. I think we've got a full house, so we may have to move in as more and more people come. I think finding places to park is a little tricky. Wealth for the Common Good, for those of you who don't know, is a national organization that is a network of business leaders, high-income individuals, and partners that work together to promote a shared prosperity and tax fairness. We are one of the critical voices in Washington and around the country. We know that people listen when Wealth for the Common speaks up because there aren't that many groups of us. We represent the 1% and those who really want a healthy, stable, sustainable economy that works for everyone. So our membership includes entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, school teachers, engineers, elected officials, people from around the country, and many of you in this room tonight. So thank you for your membership and participation and voices with Wealth for the Common Good. I know we've got a lot of people here tonight that I recognize, and thrilled that you were all here. I saw that Mark Ritchie came in, but he was swamped, so I didn't get to see him. Where'd you go, Mark? There he is, way back. Thank you for coming. Mark and Chuck have been longtime friends, so Mark always shows up when Chuck comes, so it's lovely to have you. Thank you. Yes. Just to tell you a little bit about how Chuck and I met. I went to Boston a few years ago and went to the Kennedy School of Government and then knew that I wasn't ready to come home, that I somehow hadn't really done what I needed to do. And I ended up taking an interim executive director job with a national economic justice group called United for a Fair Economy. And that turned out to be a very good thing for me to do because Chuck was the co-founder of that organization. And while he was no longer there, that's how I got connected to Chuck, and when I moved back to the Twin Cities, became involved in Wealth for the Common Good. So as you know, over the last 30 years, economic disparities have only grown due to our economic policies. And they have disproportionately benefited the nation's top earners. And at the peak of the economic crisis, Chuck and those around him said, we need to organize a network of people of wealth and means and influence to really stand up and produce an economy, project an economy that really works for everyone. So our role is to contribute to the public debate on taxes and inequality by amplifying those voices of those who benefited the most from public investments, who have the greatest capacity to pay, and who believe they should be asked to provide more for the common good. So we encourage you all to check out our website, pick up our literature, and sign on. You don't have to be part of the 1% to be part of Wealth for the Common Good, although we do leverage those 1% voices. In the past year, the landscape, as everyone knows, has shifted. Occupy Wall Street, we are the 1%, have now made a passionate call for equity in this country and around the globe. And that has opened a space for us that really hadn't been there before. And it's really allowed us to do work that we have not been able to do because there's more interest from the media, there's more interest from people. People are interested in the information. And I was at a meditation retreat a couple of weeks ago with a Buddhist teacher, quite a master. And one of the things he talked about was how many Western people go to India, Nepal, Tibet, on a spiritual quest because they feel that spiritual heart energy in those places. But he said, if you notice, the minds aren't always as developed. They don't really organize government to deliver the services that we have, like running water, hot water, electricity that works 24/7. So he said, I'd love to come to this country because everything works. It's so wonderful to get under a hot shower. But he said the West's work right now is to develop a mature heart. And I thought, that was a very important thing for me to think about, that I can get so frustrated in this work sometimes because I'm talking to such incredibly bright people. They don't always get it. And I thought, that's the work. And those of us who tend to have progressive politics, we love our statistics and our facts. We've got to learn to tell more stories and to speak more from the heart. So I think tonight is going to be a night you'll get some facts and figures, but we also want to really think about what it means to speak from the heart. So I'm going to introduce the panel first, and then Chuck will speak for a few minutes, and then we will have some questions that the panel will have a discussion about, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. We'll end the evening with, you can get the books outside, and then Chuck will be at this table up here to sign them, and a little bit more about those logistics when we get there. So Chuck was born into the 1%, and in fact, he went to the same high school as Mitt Romney in Detroit.
Was he nice to you?
I have some stories.
Oh, yes, the stories are coming.
True story.
So Chuck is the great-grandson of the 19th century meatpacking mogul, Oscar Mayer. You might be able to get him to do that theme song if you're really happy. And Chuck really first caught national attention when, at age 26, he gave away an inheritance of $500,000. That was over 25 years ago. So do the math to think about what that would be worth today.
Dang.
We'd all be in such good shape. But Chuck has always been passionate about a just society. And that's one of the things that I think draws people to him, is that he lives his values every day. And he continues to be committed to those values. He is an author and senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he directs the program on inequality and the common good. He is one of the country's most recognized and well-known names on inequality, so you're in for a real treat tonight. And he was one of the first to recognize that we need to bring business people and investment people to the table to talk about how do we build a really just and equitable society. He's worked with a lot of prominent names. He might tell you a story or two about Bill Gates Sr. They ended up writing a book together on the estate tax and why it's necessary to preserve that. He's worked with George Soros, lots of people on tax equity. And tonight he's here to talk about his new book, 99 to 1, How Wealth Inequality is Wrecking the World and What We Can Do About It. And I can tell you, I know a lot about inequality, not as much as he does, but I'm pretty well versed. It's a marvelous book because it really gives you everything you need to know in 125 pages, and then all the resources to go look at those facts and figures we love if we want more. I also then will introduce the panel, and then we'll turn the mic over to Chuck. Trista Harris is on the my far left. Trista is the Executive Director at Headwaters Foundation for Justice, and I'm sure many of you recognize Trista. Headwaters is a community foundation with a mission to act as a catalyst for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. And she oversees the whole foundation, of course. And many of her fabulous staff are here tonight. Trista is also nationally known as a passionate advocate for new leaders in the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. She's a leading voice for generations X and Y and seeks to create professional development opportunities for them. She writes a blog on the generational change in the foundation field, and her blog is called New Voices of Philanthropy, if you want to check that out. So she's an international speaker on these issues, working across generations to create social change. Maureen, in the middle, Maureen Ramirez, is the new Policy and Research Director at Growth and Justice. So welcome to your new role. It's exciting to have you. And for those of you who don't know, Growth and Justice is a statewide nonprofit committed to a fair and prosperous economy. Maureen has been the Director of Capitol River Council, the Downtown St. Paul Neighborhood Association, before coming to Growth and Justice. And her work has focused over the years on civic engagement, outreach, voter outreach, working with these well-known, loved places, Wellstone Action, Minnesota Council for Nonprofits. She also worked as an admissions advisor at the University of Minnesota, and that's where she really developed her passion for working with policy, when she saw so many young, undocumented workers and their families trying to figure out how to get them to college. Julie Ristow, sitting next to Chuck, and a longtime friend of Chuck, they go way back, is the co-director of On the Commons. She has an extensive background in leadership development, community organizing, publishing, and agriculture. And Julie and I are proud Iowa people. We love rural America. She helped launch the Upbeat Reader magazine and served as publisher and co-chair. She was executive director of the National League of Rural Voters. And she was the endowed chair of the University for the Agricultural Systems at the University of Minnesota's Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, and she still sits on their board. She has many accomplishments, including helping to launch the new effort, Homegrown Minneapolis, the initiative to expand local food and sustainable ag. So we want to leave enough time at the end so you have a chance to really talk to these people one-on-one. So I'm going to stop with that now and hand over to Chuck.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks again for getting us together, and for Headwaters and Growth and Justice and groups here. And I have to say a couple people in the room I should salute here. You heard in Ann's introduction that I'm the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, so when my dad used to say, bringing home the bacon has a different meaning in our family. And I remember after, when I was in college, my professor was Peter Ratcliffe, who's here, who wrote the history, the social history. I learned a lot about labor history from Peter, and we were, at that time, watching the restructuring of the meatpacking industry as it was happening, and how it was moving further to the west and out into the other plain states. And so there was a chain of events that happened that ended with Hormel here. And I also, in terms of this space, Mark Ritchie showed me around a little bit, and including the room dedicated to Rachel. And I remember reading a book that was written here called Prime Cut. That's sort of a memoir of a woman who grew up in the meatpacking plant, worked in a meatpacking plant. I think her name was Cheryl. Anyway, so I have, and that's just the beginning of some of the obligations I have to people in this room. So let me just mention that, as well as United for a Fair Economy was co-founded with a woman named Felicia Skell, and I'm just curious if any of you knew Felicia Skell. So I just also this book is actually dedicated to her. She's really the person who she was raised working class, Lower East Side of New York, and she and I together really did a lot of work on these issues of class and inequality going back 20 years, and so I would lift her up. And as Ann mentioned, I went to the same high school as Mitt Romney, Cranbrook School outside Detroit, and the school motto was aim high. And the emblem was a archer shooting an arrow straight into the air. If you think about it, it's a really bad idea. And I kind of think that's where Mitt is at. Shooting that arrow straight up into the air. Something that Katniss Everdale would never do, right? But I did know him. He was an older, he was like the senior, and I was a 7th grader. And we lived on the same golf course and sledded on the same sledding hill, so I knew him, and I can tell you, he had a really nice sled. His dad was there, so I can tell you more about that. But and there was a whole lot of growing up in a boys' prep school modeled after an English prep school. There was a huge amount of hazing and kind of ritual abuse, even when I was there. I'm ashamed to remember things that I saw where I stood by. And you play over in your head the times that you wished you had stepped in. And I can't for the life of me imagine that anybody would forget those experiences, as he said he has, whether he was party to them or a witness to them. It was, think Lord of the Flies, boys prep school. So this conversation, which I'm looking forward to having with my co-panelists and you all, I think is really inspired by the work that emerged in the fall. I remember looking at the website, We Are the 99%, and reading the stories. Ann says, this is really about stories, not data. And people would take a picture of themselves, often with a written statement. And some of you are nodding your head, you've probably read some of those. I still go back and read them, because new ones are being posted every day. And I remember one woman wrote, I used to dream about being the first woman president. Now I dream about having a job with health insurance. And another woman wrote, I'm working, I'm trying to save for my wedding. and I'm a new immigrant, and I'm working full-time in a restaurant bussing tables so I can help my father pay off his medical debts. So I'm 21 and I feel like my whole life is going to be consumed by debt. We are the 99%. And a young man who just returned from Afghanistan wrote, I enlisted to defend my country, and I went to Afghanistan and I realized that I was actually working to help politically connected contractors. And I came back to the country ravaged by the greed of bankers. And I now am in this Occupy movement. We are the 99% movement. He says, this is the second time I fought for my country, but the first time I've understood who my enemy was. I am the 99%. You read those stories and you realize people trapped in not finding a pathway out of poverty, or people who had the middle class dream of retiring before they died, stopping work, staying in the house that they lived in their whole life without losing it, maybe passing on something to their children, maybe having a vacation, having that middle class dream be pulled out from under them, or young people who followed their advice of their elders and went to college and now have tens of thousands of dollars of debt with no plan to pay it off. And you realize, even if the political situation looks bleak, that the underlying conditions that gave rise to the movements of the fall are not going away. And that the current political system is incapable of responding to those urgent cries for help. We may be distracted, we may be deflected, we may be deflected to look at scapegoats and immigration issues and that sort of thing. But the underlying insecurity and economic changes are not going away. We are in a deep shift, transition to a new economy for ecological and economic reasons. And the pressure is just going to keep building for some kind of realignment, some kind of change. So that's the context I want to offer up, that those stories reveal statistics that I think I'm not going to go into. The Federal Reserve, however, just did their every 3-year report on the state of America's wealth last week, and found that the median income households' real wealth declined by 39% between 2007 and 2010. Think about that. That's the median income family. What about people in the bottom half? What about households of color for whom whatever wealth gains there were over that last decade were largely in housing? So we've seen an evaporation of housing wealth, unprecedented in our lifetimes. Over that period, over the last 10 years, almost all the growth in income, the wealth income gains 93% went to the 1%. So we're just living in an economy that is redistributing wealth upwards at a dizzying pace. The framework. Some of you, I wrote a book and we did a crowdsourcing to get the title. It came up with 99-1, How Wealth Inequality is Wrecking the World. But as I've been now talking to people don't generally like that framing, or I don't always feel positive about it. And I think the reasons are obvious. 99-1 is a very symbolic, simple framing. But it has some utility, it has some value that I want to mention. But obviously, one of the limitations is if you're in the bottom 20%, or in the bottom 95th percentile, you're living in a different world, right? You're living in a different universe. The idea that we are the 99% all together have some kind of common experiences should not be an excuse to render invisible the huge differences. The racial wealth disparities with their very different roots and causes and history. The gender differences around race or around these inequalities, and age differences. This economy is a wholly different economy if you're under 35 and trying to move forward in your life as opposed to being over 45. So to lump everyone together is obviously silly. Same with the 1%. And I would, part of the work that Anna and I have done is to organize people in the 1%. There's a huge number of allies in the 1% for this movement for a fair economy. But there's a segment of the 1% that I would call the game riggers, the rule fixers, who use their wealth and power to rig the rules So the economy basically generates more wealth and income for that 1%. And those are the folks that we should be holding to account. But the good news is there is wealth for the common good and patriotic millionaires and allies in the 1%. So neither of these groups can be our monolithic. That said, I think it's very interesting that if we can get people to think in terms of a 99-to-1 framework, it helps in a couple of things. One, it creates a clear demand. The economy should be organized to lift up the 100%, not the 1%. We're living through a period where the rules of the economy have been tilted to benefit the 1% at the expense of everyone else. That's a very important analytic point. Obviously, if you're in the 95th percentile, you've benefited from some of those rule changes. And if you're in the bottom 20%, you're in a whole different, having a different experience. But if we can get people to stop thinking in such a divided way, just to have that understanding, we have rigged the rules of the economy. The rules have been tilted tax policy, trade policy in that way. And it creates an interesting political opportunity. In my old classmate Mitt Romney, you couldn't have a better, more quintessential candidate of the 1%. I mean, think about it. Tax shelters, offshore tax havens. The guy's got $20 million in the Cayman Islands. Or think about the ways in which tax policy benefits the 1% at the expense of everybody else. Here's a guy who earned $21 million last year and paid 15% of his income in taxes. The tax policies there's a set of tax rules that benefit the 1% and a different set of tax rules for everybody else. So if we can help explain that political difference, I think it's powerful. Let me just say three things, though, that we can talk more about these. One is that these inequalities really matter. There was a debate a couple years ago. Does inequality matter? Yes, poverty matters. But does the gap, how much wealth the wealthy hold, does that really matter? Is that relevant? Now I would argue you could have a whole department at the University of Minnesota that just inequality studies, that looks at sociology, economics, ecology, sport, culture, every dimension of our lives. Basically, everything we care about. Whatever you care about, children, health, you care about sports, culture, you care about the state of our democracy, the stability of the economy, you care about social mobility, the idea that if you're born into one place that you have the opportunity to improve your circumstances. If you care about that, you should be very aware that these inequalities are destroying, are undermining everything that we care about. And at the core of that is when a society pulls apart too wide, it leads to a breakdown in solidarity. The notion that we're all in the same boat. An injury to one is an injury to all. And that, at the core of that, is the breakdown of empathy and connection, the great disconnect. When the 1% delinks, and not only leaves and occupies the other side of the tracks, but occupies another universe, taking not only their money and tax dollars, but their stake in the functioning of the commonweal, and pull that away, that has a destructive impact on the whole workings of the society. So these inequalities matter, and I'm not going to go into more of that, but that's part of the case that I think we need to make. The second is that these inequalities are reversible. They are not the function of weather events. There are weather events going on for sure, but the economy, and more the economy and the weather are going to be woven together. But these can be reversed. The United States lived through a period of extreme inequality a century ago and reversed it, thanks to the social movements of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, all pushed for greater equity, rule changes that raise the floor and address the concentration of wealth. And again, I won't go through the laundry list of public policies, but we need to be very bold about saying, not only do we need to raise the floor, raise the minimum wage, address health care. A lot of European countries have much less levels of inequality because they have high floors through which no one will fall. But we also have to say, we've lived through redistribution of wealth, We've lived through a period of redistribution of wealth upward, and we have to redistribute wealth through taxation, through rewiring the corporation so that they don't generate these extreme inequalities in the money. We can talk more about that in our discussion. But my experience now from being on the road for a couple of months talking about this is most of what I think people are saying is, hey, is it too late? Is there any possibility? It does kind of look bleak if you look at the current political atmosphere. If you think about what policies need to happen and the fact that certainly at the federal level, things are completely locked down. Their corporate capture of our democratic system is not complete, but it's very advanced. How do we move forward in that environment? And so let me just offer 3 quick reasons why I think we have some reason for possibility. One is there is a huge awakening happening in this country about these inequalities. That is not just sort of the Occupy movement. I've moved a lot in religious circles. The conversation about the economy in religious circles has now taken a huge leap forward. The ethics and moral window, the discussion about economic life is totally shifted. The other thing that's cool is people are not waiting for Congress or President Obama or anyone else to lead on this. They are figuring out ways to take action. So whether it's the Move to Amend movement to press for reforms in the Citizens United, or Move Your Money, people taking money out of the big banks and moving it into community development credit unions and local banks. People are looking for places to move and take action, recognizing that the current political moment opportunities are blocked. But the third thing I would say is that there is the potential for a realignment. It may not happen this year, but again, those underlying conditions aren't going away. The current political system is incapable of addressing the needs of 80% of the population, and that will lead to political pressure. So if we keep doing the work and the education work, something's got to shift. Something's got to shift. And I want to close with a story about one of the things I saw recently. I've been working on an effort to pass a financial transaction tax, a Wall Street, very modest tax on purchase and sale of financial stocks and bonds, derivatives, currencies, and the like. If we passed a penny tax on every $4 of financial transactions, it would generate $200 to $300 billion a year in revenue. And it would also put a little bit of a slowdown on sort of high-frequency trading, which is so destructive to the economy. And I was recently at a rally in Washington in favor of this financial transaction tax. Now, I can tell you a year ago that the number of people who were having this conversation could fit in this room. But here were 7,000 people marching for a financial transaction tax. Now, how was that possible? Well, 6,000 of them were nurses. Are there any nurses in the room? Okay, thank you. Nurses Union, one of the National Nurses Union, has made this their cause. And so I'm in this march, and I'm walking along. There's a woman, Eleanor, I'm talking to. She says, I'm from Taunton, Massachusetts. I'm from Boston. We start to talk. I said, Eleanor, how did you get here? She said, well, I got off my shift last night at 8 o'clock. And I got on the bus with my sisters and brothers, and we came down all the way from Taunton to Washington, and we're marching. And by the way, she's wearing a red shirt that says, you know, if you save a life, you're a hero. If you save 100 lives, you're a nurse. And she's holding up a sign that says, Heal America, Tax Wall Street. And there's thousands of them, right? So, well, Eleanor, okay, but why are you here? She says, oh, that's easy. I work as an emergency room nurse. For the last 4 years, I have watched the impact of this economy come into the emergency room on the bodies of my patients. And, you know, at a certain point, you just can't, I've seen people coming in, inflicting harm on themselves, on people they love. I've seen people with stress-related illnesses. She says, what really clinched it was a couple weeks ago, I was doing an intake. A man had come in with chest pains. He's having a heart attack, he says. He's on the gurney. I say, Mr. Douglas, what's your address? And he starts to cry. He says, I just lost the house that I've been living in for 4 years. That's why I'm having these chest pains. And Eleanor looks at me and she says, you see that enough? You realize you've got to, it's not just enough to do your job anymore. You've got to stand up to the greed that's destroying the fibers of our country. So that's why I got on the bus. And that's the good news, is a lot of people are getting on the bus.
Really stuck out is how the broader community is really starting to see some of the issues that people of color have been facing for generations and generations, and that there's this outcry that's really building in our community that I think is going to make it a better place for all of us.
Great. Good. I was expecting it to be longer. Sorry. That's great. No, we're under time pressure, so that's wonderful. Marie.
Yes. Key takeaway for me, I thought, was the re-engineering of the corporation. We hear so much repeatedly about the redesign of the public sector and how the public sector is failing or bloated or inefficient or anything like that. And while we're all for redesigning some functions in the public sector, we would also like for the business sector to take some responsibility for their own problems.
Key takeaway for me was just to build a little bit on what you were saying in the last comments there, Chuck. I was really struck by the language of waking up and reclaiming, and connected to that mature heart. I was really struck by the kind of the trajectory of history and the hope in that. So I'm just looking at the tipping point of the people who are waking up. There's a lot of hope there. And you're thinking about the three things that you said, what needs to change is a shift in values, a shift in power, and a shift in rules. And so for the work that we do in the Commons, it's like, how do you wake people up? And opening up this opportunity right now it is rising. I believe all of us are thinking that, saying that. It's the work of living in that space of the opening and being willing to walk in that space of the waking up, I think. So I was really struck by how you tied that history in and was able to kind of draw those conclusions at the end. That's really powerful.
And certainly one thing that I think everyone here has concerns about is the inequality that is often overlooked. The historical policies that have created so much disparity within communities of color versus the white community. And recent data show median white household income at multiples of Latino, Asian, or African American families. So would you just kick us off and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting conversations that's come up with the whole Occupy movement and the 99% conversation is where are people of color in that conversation? And right as the Occupy protests were starting, Fox News was starting this sort of controversy about the movement, which I know is a surprise to all of you that do that sort of thing. But what they said is that Acorn was actually sort of the impetus behind this Occupy movement, that they were secretly funneling all of this money and strategy and tactics to move Occupy forward. And so, of course, they went and interviewed the director formerly of Acorn, because they had disappeared as an organization, and said, tell us about this sort of secret strategy that you had to take over. And the director said, if Acorn as an organization could have mobilized millions of young white college students from around the country around these issues that we care about, don't you think we would have done that before you shut us down? Like, we would have done this a long time ago. So I think that these things have been happening in communities of color for a very long time. But when the economy started to collapse, it pulls down the curtains that people feel really comfortable. If you have a lot of home equity, you feel like everything's okay. And issues of poverty and inequality and health care and jobs and those sorts of things, it's not really your issue, so you don't have to worry about it. But when everything collapses, then suddenly you realize it is your issue, and there's something that isn't really right in our community. So we know when I think about income inequality and racial disparities in every area that you can think of in Minnesota, I live a lot of it through my family. I'm biracial. My father's African American, my mother's white. They were both in the military together in the Vietnam War. And because they were dating men, my father was dishonorably discharged. He had a sergeant and didn't appreciate that he was in an interracial relationship, and so he was discharged. And with that, lost all of the benefits that comes with military service. So later when they divorced, my mother was able to buy a house with the GI Bill, was able to go back and get additional college education and those sorts of things. My father lost all of those benefits, and so we're living it in our house now. He's had the same job for almost 30 years and was laid off about 2 years ago. He is now occupying my office, and so it's been one of those things where we're figuring out how that works for our family and how that's part of a much bigger picture. And I think the hope for him in all of this is that he's not the only person that's going through this. If it was just him, he take it really personally. But when you see that a system that you put faith in your entire life is failing everybody, then something's wrong and something different has to happen. So I think that both in communities of color, with middle-class folks that have been comfortable for a little while and feel like, well, maybe the American dream's a real thing, are realizing, okay, maybe it isn't a real thing. What do we have to do about this? And for white middle-class and upper-class folks, this isn't working for me either. We have to develop a system that works for all of us. And when we can see that our politicians are much more interested in bailing out banks and individual homeowners, it lets us all know that something's wrong.
Thank you.
Laura, I think the stories that every one of us has in our families right now, if we had the time to tell those, would be amazing. So thank you for sharing one of yours. Maureen, do you want to comment on some of that from where you sit?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be honest, when I first read the book, I felt like there was a lens about racial disparities that was missing in there, and that the idea of the 99 was just a little bit too big for me. And that it really, while it told a story about inclusion, it was really masking disparities because there is structural racism and a history that on purpose was excluding certain populations of people. And that was a missing element. But the longer that I sat with it and the more that I came around to the idea that actually what we need is a shared story, and that there is a value to one narrative coming together that says we're all in this together, and what happens to one of us happens to all of us. So while I think the solutions are going to definitely need some very specific ways that they address racial disparities and imbalances in society today, I think the sharing of the 99 story is a useful framework to go out with, because as has been proven, the story stays at the margins and it stays just inside the communities of color, and they are not organized enough or aren't able to wield enough power to get something changed, nothing changes. I think the communities that feel marginalized need support from the other 98% or whoever they are to join with them. And frankly, that's part of the reason I work at Growth and Justice, because it's a majority organization with very much a majority constituency that's really concerned about equity. And I think their voice needs to be in the conversation so it doesn't remain on the margins.
Great. Chuck, do you have any response or?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's changed the politics is the impact on the white middle class. That's what sort of the 2008 economic meltdown more intensely affected communities of color, but it sort of took the mask away. I think electricity, sort of what was holding the mythology in place was the fact that real wages had been stagnant or falling for 80% of the population for 30 years, but people were able to survive, if they were surviving, by borrowing, working more hours, and taking on more debt. And so then when the sort of the debt machinery seized up, all of a sudden the mask was ripped away, and I think as Trista said, more people experienced something that people of color have been experiencing for the history of the United States. They experienced their vulnerability and economic insecurity, and that is what created then, in a way, gave rise to both the Tea Party politics and as well as sort of just the upheaval. There's a sort of theory, though, that so if you push for solutions and remedies that will address the concerns of the middle class, and there's some of this framing going on, rebuild the dream, rebuild the American dream, versus addressing poverty, that you will sort of solve the problem for the politically connected middle class, and then then everyone will fall back asleep again. And what I think is different is I don't think the current political system is going to solve the problem even for the white middle class. You know, the gig is up. So that creates an interesting opportunity for a shared story. But it is, you know, with the Federal Reserve data that just came out showed, you know, households of color have had in 2007 10 cents on the dollar for white wealth. You know, average median white household had $1 for every dollar. Households of color had 10 cents. 3 years go by, now it's a nickel. So the way that the race experience cuts, we can't just have solutions that are sort of generic populace. They have to be very looking at the roots of the racial wealth divide, which is a different story, which is the story of the legacy of white affirmative action after World War II that put white households on the wealth building train, you know, the GI Bill, the home mortgage programs after World War II that were highly racialized, enabled the creation of the post-World War II white middle class, put a lot of people on the wealth building train, whereas households of color didn't get on the train. And so lo and behold, a generation later, we have even more persistent racial wealth inequality. So none of the solutions can ignore the different story that led to that.
We're seeing signs all around our country and internationally that people are standing up and standing with and standing for a different story. Definitely, I would say that the biggest thing that we look for is just people's willingness to reclaim their agency in their life and to say that we can do things, we can reclaim, we can reconnect to our government in a more humane way, in a more direct way, and take action. And so some of the things, you know, if you think about some of the things that we've talked about that are commodified and expropriated, you know, everything from the patenting of genes and life forms, privatizing water and land, the use of copyrights to lock up our creativity, attempts to transform, you know, our internet into closed, protected spaces. Just think of all the things. We think about the idea of enclosure. We're seeing a lot of people standing up and saying, you can't do that. You cannot steal that wealth from us. That wealth belongs to all of us. We need to protect it for future generations. And so a lot of hope in that way of standing up and standing with to say, yes, we can reclaim. So we think that that's one of the first steps in a transition or an economy, that people aren't consumers in this economy. They're producers, they're creators, they're co-creators. They can take action and get things done. And so I'd say the other thing that's really, really promising is the connection in this transition economy to an intergenerational canvas, the connection we have to our younger generation right now, whose economic life is decidedly different from ours. I think about enclosure of my kid who's 17, who's getting ready to go to college, and the debt around that. Young people are standing up to say, we can't pay that debt off. They lived with the internet for years. They live in a co-generative, co-creative economy already, and how they do their social networks and how they think about themselves as co-producers. So I see a lot of push and momentum coming from that generation. And as a baby boomer, I'm listening pretty carefully to that. And I think there's a lot of hope there. So more participation, more personal responsibility, more transparency. And as we say in the Commons also leads us to a framework and a practice of actually knowing how to share your resources and govern them together. So I think that's a big part of the new economy, is standing up to say some things belong to all of us. We can share those things. You've probably all heard a lot about the sharing economy. Certainly the transition communities, all of those things have a lot of self-agency involved, a connection to reclaiming, seeing and naming things differently and taking action. And many times building things from the ground up. Right here, Going on this week, we have a new effort in Minneapolis called the Minneapolis Reclamation Festival. In communities, very poor, income communities, places that have been somewhat culturally devastated, there's a whole effort to rebuild blocks, to reclaim intersections, to build beautiful things together, to say that beauty matters, to surround their public education, their schools, and a lot going on. So those are some examples, I would say, of sort of the first steps and the leaning towards that new, you say it's leaning towards the transition in a new economy.
That's exciting to hear some of those real examples too. I think the other thing for me is that really because of the ecological crisis, yes, we have global warming. I don't think anyone can doubt that. But we're also maxing out on resource depletion. We are just hitting limits after limit after limit. And so we literally cannot go back to the economy that many of us grew up with. And so any thoughts about the implications that in order to reverse inequality, we do have to do it in a very different way. And I think you've given us some real insights into what that means. Anyone else just have any thoughts about that, or what you see as a vision of a fairer economy from your perspective?
One of the things that I've heard that I really enjoyed, Angela Glover-Blackwell, who's at PolicyLink,
Can you say that again? I couldn't hear on the side.
Yep, Angela Glover-Blackwell from PolicyLink has been saying equity is the superior growth model. So as we're thinking about how to really get out of this situation, building a framework or equity will get us where we want to be faster. And I think when I think about equity as a growth model, it's really about having people at the table. And David, who's the program director at Headwaters, loves to say, if you're not at the table, you might just be on the menu. And there's more and more opportunities for us to make sure that we're at the table when it comes to transit development, when it comes to what's going to happen to our neighborhoods and our communities in the future. We had a great example of this a couple of years ago with the light rail redevelopment on University Avenue. A lot of Headwaters grantees were organizing together because the plan was to completely skip low-income neighborhoods. And everybody was fine with this. And I had just started at Headwaters, and one of the organizers was trying to explain to me what the issue was. And she said, the federal government says you can only have so many stops, and there's a formula. And the way that it's set up now, it's missing the low-income neighborhoods that are transit dependent. And I said, well, has there been any conversation about moving some of the stops from the higher income neighborhoods to the lower income neighborhoods? And then she just stared at me for a little bit and she said, of course there hasn't been that conversation, that's not going to happen. So what they ended up doing is lobbying to change federal policy. So they changed the formula that's used to decide how many stops, and equity became a part of the process as transit's being developed. So whenever people say, communities can't really have a say on these sort of things, the problem is too big, it's a policy issue, there's nothing that we can do about it. There's a lot that you can do about it, and when you do, it changes that fight for the next community as they're building their line. So I feel like as we're redefining what this looks like, it can be much better than any of us have ever expected, but we just have to be ready for the process to get there.
Wonderful example. Maureen?
Yes, so we're in an organization called Growth and Justice, and it's named that for a very simple reason, which is we believe we can grow an economy and make it also more just at the same time. Equity is a good stand-in for the word that we're using, which is justice. And that's the framework we're applying to investments in education, investments in healthcare, and investments in transportation as an infrastructure for Minnesota. When I think about a fairer economy, it certainly doesn't include borrowing money from our children and then turning around and building a Vikings stadium. That's not something that is helping us move towards equity. What I think about is universal health care. Growth and Justice just put out a report saying, regardless of what happens in 2 days, with the Supreme Court decision that we can cover people in Minnesota with a higher level of benefits than the Affordable Care Act and still save money, that there's a plan for a universal and unified system and a stronger safety net, that a fairer economy would have a higher standard for taking care of the people around us and the neighbors that we have. And those things, together with a stronger education system and a more affordable one, to your point, are the things we need to drive this economy forward. We're big fans of Angela Blackwell in the same way, thinking that a more equitable economy is one that can grow faster and can bring more things to the region.
I would say there's sort of a corollary to what you're saying, which is an extremely unequal society blocks the society's our ability to make an orderly transition to this new economy. So the fact that the 1%, in the oil industries and a couple thousand global corporations that are firmly rooted in the dinosaur economy, are happy with the way things are working, block our ability to move toward a more equitable, sustainable economy. And I think that's that. And when Anna asked what's the vision? I think that I think we're starting to find a language to talk about, a Main Street economy that doesn't have these great inequalities versus a Wall Street kind of casino speculative economy that is really about siphoning wealth out of our communities off into, a stratosphere. I think that there's an emerging business sector, the local living economy movement. There's Business Alliance for Local Living Economy. These are actual businesses concerned about wealth and prosperity in their communities, creating real wealth as opposed to phantom wealth. And I'd like to think there's a sort of distinction between these built-to-last corporations, built-to-last businesses that are anchored, rooted, more accountable to the localities, and the built-to-loot companies that are whose entire business model is about extracting wealth from our communities, shifting costs off of their own balance sheets. So the built-to-last, Jim Collins, the business journalist, talks about the characteristics of a built-to-last company. But we're really up against a couple thousand built-to-loot companies. So I think that the vision is all the stuff that I think is emerging around us, the local food movement, the local production, value added to the food, local transportation, enterprises that are rooted in localities. There is this new economy emerging all around us that relocalized, but at the same time there's the old economy, the built-to-loot economy, which is we can't ignore. So we have to look at how do we address the concentration of corporate power? How do we recharter corporations at the federal level? If they're so big and they operate across state and national boundaries, they should be subject to an entirely different set of rules. When the next time we have to break up the mega banks. These banks are so big, they're not only too big to save, they're almost, not too big to fail, they're too big to save. The next time one of them starts to wobble and comes back to Congress with their hand out begging for more taxpayer relief, we just have to say you're too big, you need to be broken into smaller pieces. They're using our tax dollars to grow, expand market share, and fend off oversight and regulation. So I think the transition to the new economy has to both work on the building the new economy at the local level, building the new institutions and capacity. I'm very, the transition movement, the transition towns, all that stuff I think is very interesting in terms of helping us imagine and also reskill ourselves for the new economy. I think one of the great injustices we're doing is to young people is to say, go to school and learn the skills for the old economy. And we're all going to be information workers, we're all going to work in banks. What are rich kids doing? Let me tell you what rich kids are doing. They're learning how to grow food. They're woofing. They're going on trips around the world, working at organic farms. They're buying land. Hello. And what are we doing with young communities of color? We're going to teach you to be a banker. So you'll have the middle class jobs that aren't going to exist. It's cruel. It's a hoax. So I think that part of the transition into the economy is really rethinking what do we value in terms of skills and knowledge, and the sort of classist division of labor between working with your hands versus working with your head and all that stuff. That's got to go if we're going to make this transition.
You know, one thing that has really been speaking to me lately is I've been reading Riane Eisler again. Those of you who remember
Caring
Chalice
Economy, yeah.
play. And now she has a book, The Caring Economy. Some of you know it. And she talks about how we have to revalue the economy and include more in it, and then measure things differently as well. So some quick examples. The Gulf of Mexico carries no value in our GDP until we're cleaning up an oil spill. And then GDP goes way up because we're paying people to clean the oil, we're paying the lawyers, woo. My niece who just had a baby, she's been home taking care of her baby this spring, and the GDP goes down because she's no longer productive. But in the fall, when she goes back to teaching and hires someone, she'll be productive, the babysitter will be productive, GDP goes up. Why is it that we tell young people that staying home with your own child is unproductive? That is the message we give them. I mean, it's craziness, but that is the message. We don't value the trees until we cut them down. And so we have to rethink how we measure what is of value and how we incorporate that into the broader picture of what our economy is, what it measures, and until we begin to measure caring, I don't think we're going to get to safety. I think we're going to continue to destroy, particularly the planet, until we measure really what creates a healthy planet. And we aren't going to have healthy families until we begin to measure economically what creates healthy families.
Well, I mean, I think that they don't have to renounce their citizenship to have all the benefits of living in the United States and avoid responsibility. However, some have still figured out that they're going to move their self offshore. I mean, the fact is, there's an offshore system, an offshore tax system that enables wealthy people and a couple thousand global corporations to move wealth and money offshore, avoid oversight, accountability, and taxes. I used to think, by the way, I don't know if people are familiar with this, right? So, Federal Express or Pfizer Drug or General Electric, these companies enjoy all the benefits of operating in the United States business environment, Apple Computer, but have created subsidiaries offshore or move money offshore in a way that they can move to a secrecy jurisdiction or an offshore tax haven. I used to think that this was kind of an interesting sideshow to what was going on in the economy, but actually it's really center stage. That ability really has accelerated over the last 10 years to avoid, the wealthy don't have to renounce their citizenship, they can just simply create offshore subsidiaries of themselves and their industries and get all the perks and all the benefits of doing business in the United States without having to pay and having any responsibility. So I think the action item is, first there's a new documentary that premiered at Sundance that I was part of called We're Not Broke. You should show that. It's a very wonderful story about the U.S. Uncut movement a year ago and the effort to kind of draw attention to the offshore system. There's a British journalist named Nicholas Shaxson who wrote a book called Treasure Islands, which is about this offshore system. If you care about poverty in the global south, you should definitely learn how corporations move money and the wealthy elites of countries in the global south move money out of their countries, take their wealth out of those countries using this offshore system. And if you're interested in the solutions, obviously Senator Carl Levin has the Stop Tax Haven Abuse Act, which would shut down a whole bunch of these offshore systems. Actually, the Obama administration has been doing a good job doing what they can with treaties and other systems to close down some of those offshore loopholes. But it's a huge factor. There's just nothing we can do in the domestic context if we just leave the whole back door open for these companies and wealthy individuals to avoid responsibility and taxation.
And two things I would add. Frank Hornstein, is he here tonight? He had hoped to come. He is doing a lot of that work on the state level. I see Dane Smith, head of Growth and Justice, shaking his head. So Frank is kind of your go-to guy at our own Capitol. And then on Monday night, July 2nd, We're Not Broke is showing at the St. Anthony Main Theater. It's part of the Progressive Caucus tour. So that was part of my closing notes, so just get it on your calendar, Monday night, July 2nd.
A couple of things have changed since the economic meltdown, which are interesting. We have a very high tolerance for inequality in the United States. We tolerate extreme levels of inequality, partly because, and polls show, if people believe that the economy is fair, it's that the people are earning their wealth fairly, they don't begrudge that. And if they feel as if there's mobility, as long as I can be born in the bottom fifth and I can move up, then I don't have a problem with how rich the rich are. I don't have a problem with the concentration of wealth. What's changed is actually more people are saying, wow, the rules are rigged, and they're seeing the barriers to mobility, which is true. We used to think that the United States was the most socially mobile, advanced industrialized country, and we looked over at England and said, oh, England that's a caste society. You're born into the English working class, you die in the English working class. Well, guess what? That's totally flipped. Now the United States is the least socially mobile among the advanced industrial countries, and countries like Sweden and England and others, less England, but other European countries are much more socially mobile because they make investments in education and healthcare and have high social floor. They're healthier societies. So at the core, people in the United States actually want to live in societies that have the characteristics of Sweden. And they don't, but we are confused sort of about that there is a Sweden out there, that it's possible to organize things in a different way. So, but I think appealing to that aspiration is really a really important part of creating a vision forward. Part of what we have to do is rewire what we call capitalism. It is the machinery that's generating these inequalities. Part of what reason people want to live in Sweden is Sweden actually is a capitalist country that has huge amounts of the economy socially owned. That's where I think, and Julie's work around, how is it that we take the commons, the wealth that's in our communities, and nail it down so it can't be looted and taken away. And I think I think that part of the rethinking the vision of the new economy, I actually find, doing a lot of speaking and media stuff, I don't really go out and talk about capitalism, socialism. I understand that's, that. But when I think about a rewired capitalism, I see the patchwork of municipal ownership, community ownership, social ownership of various kinds, the work that's happening in Cleveland around the whole emergence of a new cooperative sector that is owned largely by people of color in a neighborhood. So those are the things that it's like it's a rewiring of capitalism.